Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, learning time. If you guys are not ready to learn, you're in the wrong class. All the things. Original link to the video, top of the description, and below that link to the Discord. I'd love to have you. My name's Connor, if you're new. Is the Middle East on the brink of wider war? I'm not going to lie. The conflict in the Middle East is even more worrying to me than the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I know Russia has, the most or the second most. I know it's close with the U.S. of nuclear weapons, and it's like, oh God, it's Russia in a war that's horrifying, which it is. But and then it's Israel, a very small country, powerful country, but small versus Gaza. Not even Palestine, but not even Gaza, but Hamas. And so it's so much smaller at first glance compared to Russia, but a little thought going into what the repercussions could be in this conflict in the Middle East, in my opinion, there is so much more to like domino effects and become a giant problem, even more so than Russia invading Ukraine. I hope that makes sense. Just the feeling I have, the uneasiness between Arabs and Israel that's been happening since the inception of Israel. And it just doesn't feel good. Doesn't look good.
As we record this, it feels like a crisis that could go either way, a pivot point in history where the world balances between two very different futures and no one is quite sure which way things will turn. In the near 2 weeks since Hamas launched its brutal attack on Israeli civilians, killing over 1,400, the Middle East has only grown more tense. Israel has pounded Gaza with rockets ahead of a likely ground assault, triggering a humanitarian crisis. In the north, Lebanon's Hezbollah have exchanged fire with the Israeli military, threatening to open a second front. Meanwhile, Iran has issued barely veiled threats, suggesting that it could also enter the war. As a result, there's now a growing sense that events cannot be contained, that October the 7th, 2023 will not go down in history as another 9/11, but another June 28th, 1914, the day a terrorist attack tipped.
Yeah, it feels, and I try not to be paranoid and stuff, but this feels like we're going through the beginning events that people would learn about in future decades of the beginning of a wider conflict. Oh yeah, the war in Ukraine broke out, and then completely unrelated war between Israel and Hamas breaks out. And it just feels like the not good.
An entire continent into war. At least, that's the doomsday scenario, the dark shadow hanging over all reporting. Yet, how likely is this to really come to pass? In today's special update, War of Graphics is digging through the noise to figure out what might come next. With the obvious caveat that events are moving fast, we'll be asking if this war really can be contained, or if it could spark a wider conflict.
I think a likely answer, or a likely thing that could happen that I think of, is maybe a new Cold War, like a second Cold War, where U.S. and its allies fund the people that they fund, and then places like China and Russia, Iran, places that want to see U.S. dominance fall, would start supporting actors in the Middle East and whatnot that fight against the Americans. And so a World War III breaking out, as in like nuclear war between like China and USA, Russia, I don't know how likely that is. And if it is, I think it's still quite a bit away. But I think a new Cold War, like full-on Cold War of two sides funding opposing people in conflicts around the world, is very possible.
In world events, there are years where nothing changes, and then there are weeks when a whole year's worth of change just happens. The near 2 weeks following Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel fall firmly into the latter category. In recent days, we've seen clashes along the Lebanese border with militant group Hezbollah, Israeli strikes on Syrian airports, and threats against Israel emanating from multiple Middle Eastern countries. In Iraq, more than 500,000 Shiites protested last week in support of Palestinians, filling Baghdad's main square and chanting, "No, no to Israel," and "No, no to America." In the Houthi-ruled capital of Yemen, similar protests broke out. Lebanon, Jordan, and Bahrain also saw rallies against Israel strikes on Gaza. The New York Times summed up the growing unrest as such.
Houthi ruled Yemen?
In the Houthi-ruled capital of Yemen, similar
I need to learn about
protests broke out. Lebanon, Jordan, and Bahrain also saw rallies against Israel strikes on Gaza. The New York Times summed up the growing unrest as such. The inferno flaring out from Gaza is turning into a potential nightmare for the entire region, threatening to destabilize not just Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. It's unrest that has only increased since the recent strike on a Gaza hospital that killed hundreds. While the origin of the blast is unknown at the time of writing, it's certainly adding to the febrile atmosphere. Not that unrest is the only thing people are worrying about. On CBS, American National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declared that, quote, "There is a risk of an escalation of this conflict, the opening of a second front in the north, and, of course, Iran's involvement." The unsaid part was what Iranian involvement in the conflict would likely mean. Extreme pressure on the United States to enter the fray to protect its ally Israel. How likely this is to happen is something we'll be analyzing throughout this video. We need to briefly sketch out how this war could theoretically expand, the network of alliances and ideologies that could potentially lead to a Middle East conflagration. Now, the key issue is something known as the axis of resistance, also sometimes referred to as the resistance front. At its most basic, the axis of resistance is a collection of governments, political parties, and armed groups that operate across the Middle East and share an antipathy towards Israel and the United States. These groups run the gamut from non-state actors like Hamas in Gaza, Shia militants in Iraq, and Houthi rebels in Yemen, to actual governing parties like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad. Originally directed by Tehran, these groups have since grown more autonomous, yet they still retain ties to the Islamic Republic. Per War on the Rocks, the axis is ideologically connected by the joint struggle of these actors against Israel, the United States, and their allies, and it is operationally supported by the Quds Force, the external arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iran.
Do you guys think that Turkey, the nation of Turkey, is quickly becoming the most significant country in the world when it comes to like what they do? Because like they're a Muslim country. They don't see themselves as an Arabic country. They're in NATO, but they're also like the one in NATO that's kind of like not fully like do you know what I mean? Like, so Turkey already is a super important factor in the war with Russia. You know, they're right there on the Black Sea. They are tied with the West and NATO, obviously, but at the same time they're kind of different. And now with the Middle East, where again they are a Muslim country, but with these two wars now breaking out, it just seems like Turkey has so much leverage, or just so much. Like they are going to play a huge part, I think, in whatever's to come.
Connection is what makes the recent warnings coming out of Tehran so disturbing. On October the 17th, Iranian Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian warned that the resistance front could carry out a preemptive action in the coming hours against Israel. Yet these various groups shouldn't just be viewed as mere puppets. As we'll see in the coming chapters, each has its own highly specific set of calculations that might make wider war more likely, or perhaps less so. Still, it's the links between Axis of Resistance members that feature in the most dire predictions of conflict, threatening as they do to drag in multiple groups at once. Right now, the worst case scenario begins with an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza that causes so many civilian casualties a member of the Axis feels compelled to respond. Most likely, this would be Hezbollah, which has tens of thousands of fighters and thousands of missiles, including precision weapons. If they open a second front in the north, Israel will be forced to strike back. Since Hezbollah are Iranian proxies, that counterstrike might include hitting targets in Iran, which might themselves be preceded by preemptive Iranian strikes against Israel. At which point, well, that's when things get really ugly. Iran is 55 minutes.
And then I think the U.S. like it feels like there's kind of becoming that the set of alliances that made like World War I go like, okay, you killed our guy, we declare war on you. Oh, well, I'm Russia, I'm going to protect Serbia, I declare war on you. Oh, I'm Germany, I'm going to protect Austria-Hungary, I'm going to declare war on you, Russia. Oh, I'm UK and France, I'm going to declare war on you, Germany.
Military bases in Syria, meaning a broader
Sorry, I'm talking too much.
That's when things get really ugly. Iran has 55 military bases in Syria, meaning a broader conflagration would almost certainly drag in the Assad regime. At the same time, Shia militants in Iraq, such as Kataib Hezbollah, have indicated their willingness to get involved, while Yemen's Houthi rebels have promised to deploy their medium-range missiles and drones if the US steps in.
I know nothing about the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They're the only one that he's mentioned so far, the only group. Like, I have a pretty good idea of Hamas, Hezbollah, but Houthi rebel, I got to learn about
fears
that.
Are turbocharged by the moribund state of many Middle Eastern economies, where young men are out of work, they're angry, and they're looking for a cause. As Harvard Belfer Center analyst Mohammed Al-Yaha told the New York Times of Hamas's October the 7th attack, right now, you've got a lot of countries in the region that have disaffected youth, bad economies, struggling people in general that are looking at this as a source of dignity, and that's dangerous. But there being a danger of unrest or war isn't the same as it being inevitable. To try and figure out the real likelihood, we're now going to zero in one of the most likely triggers for a wider conflict: Lebanon. Now, in a recent interview, former US Ambassador to Israel Martin S. Indyk expressed his pessimism about a wider war. Putting the odds of 50-50, he said, the potential for it to spread not only to Lebanon, but beyond Lebanon is very high. As we saw a minute ago, Indyk is not alone in viewing Lebanon as the most likely place to spark a regional inferno. With Iran-backed Hezbollah controlling the country's south, its border with Israel is already a hotspot. On October the 16th, the Israeli Defense Forces created an evacuation zone along the border, forcing civilians to leave 28 villages. The move followed days of cross-border exchanges which saw 2 Israelis and maybe a dozen Lebanese killed, as well as a Reuters journalist. So far, at least, these deadly exchanges are just about within the bounds of ordinary behavior from both sides. Writing for Crisis Group, research associate Heiko Women has talked about how both Israel and Hezbollah so far appear keen to stick to the established rules of the game, a complicated, unwritten set of codes that stop either side from crossing red lines. Built up over several years, these rules are a hangover from the 2006 Lebanon War, a 34-day conflict that killed more than 100 Israelis, more than 1,000 Lebanese, and left infrastructure in both North Israel and the whole of Lebanon badly damaged. Importantly, it was also a war that neither side really won. The IDF was humiliated by a weaker foe, but Hezbollah took massive casualties. Both nations, meanwhile, sustained millions of dollars worth of damage. Since then, both sides have sought to maintain a safe level of violence that is unlikely to escalate, lest it lead to a damaging repeat of 2006. Heiko Women highlights risk reduction measures like IDF warnings to Hezbollah before returning fire, and Hezbollah mostly focusing on strikes on the uninhabited Sheba farms. All of which is to say that, terrifying as they sound in the current context, the ongoing skirmishes on the Lebanese border are not definite signs that Hezbollah is about to enter the conflict. In fact, much of the violence so far seems to have been driven by Palestinian armed groups aligned with Hezbollah that are operating on Lebanese territory.
A big factor like that will, I think, tell a lot of what future response will be Lebanon, Iran's response to the inevitable ground invasion of northern Gaza that Israel's going to do. And The only reason I can think they haven't done it yet is, outcry from other countries saying, they need time to move out and you have to put in aid. But I'd imagine the main reason they're not exactly going in is shoring up intelligence and knowing if they do go in and, will Hezbollah attack? If they do we have enough people over there? And I'm sure that's the main reason why it's waiting. But as soon as the ground invasion begins, Lebanon's response to that and Iran's response is going to be very telling.
While that raises the risk of miscalculation, say an attack by one of these groups that kills a whole bunch of Israeli civilians, it might indicate Hezbollah don't want to join the fight. Imad Kehab of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. certainly thinks so. In his current view, to quote him, "It is unlikely that a conflagration on the Lebanese-Israeli border will take place." In drawing this conclusion, he pointed in a recent article to multiple factors, the three most important of which we can sum up as deterrence, economy, and internal Lebanese politics. The deterrence argument is relatively straightforward. As tensions have bubbled up, the US has responded by increasing its forces in the region, including deploying the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier and strike group as a not-so-subtle hint to the Axis of Resistance to be cool. At the same time, the New York Times reports the US Air Force is increasing its F-16, A-10, and F-15 squadrons, giving America over 100 attack planes to help protect Israel. But while this force, plus the military power of the IDF, might help dissuade Hezbollah from getting serious, it may not be the most important factor. No, that might be the state of the Lebanese economy. Since 2019, Lebanon's economy has been in freefall. Inflation remains at over 220%. Banks have collapsed. 85% of the population has dipped below the poverty line. In this collapse, Hezbollah's base has suffered as much as everybody else. Already the organization is seen as helping fuel the crisis, a crisis that would be made unimaginably worse by starting a war with Israel. As Politico put it, if Hezbollah was to initiate a war against Israel, the post-conflict backlash against the organization would likely be profound, as a sizable percentage of the Lebanese population already bitterly oppose Hezbollah's power and resent its armed status. And
that might also be a reason to do it. I definitely don't want to be too pessimistic or too worrying, but I also don't want to think that, well, look, they will lose. They're already not seen greatly by it. They'll lose even more support within Lebanon, and great as factors to why it might not. But if you get comfortable with that and don't think it can happen anyway, maybe Hezbollah can see its already bitter opposition to it as, well, we better strike now or never, or we're going to just fizzle out, and
already bitterly oppose Hezbollah's power and resent its armed status. And this brings us neatly to another factor, potentially reducing the risk of conflict: internal Lebanese politics. Politics in Lebanon is sectarian, often personality-driven, and extremely complicated. In 2006, Hezbollah were able to get the endorsement of the Christian Free Patriotic Movement in its war with Israel. In 2023, though, it's far less likely other parties will back Hezbollah. Imad Kehab writes that the current most organized Christian party, the Lebanese Forces, considers itself Hezbollah's foe. That could make waging war more difficult. Difficult, but not impossible. While there are good reasons for thinking Hezbollah may prefer to stay out of the conflict beyond occasional strikes designed to keep the IDF feeling nervous, it's not exactly a sure bet. And that's troubling because Hezbollah alone have the power to deal serious destruction. Since major organizations often refer to both Hamas and Hezbollah as militants or armed groups, it can be tempting to assume that they're somehow equivalent to ragtag anti-Israeli actors capable of causing damage but no match for the IDF. This just goes to show how simple words can sometimes obscure major differences, because Hezbollah is no more on a level with Hamas than a Premier League team is on the level with your local pub's five-a-side. Or to put it in starkly simple terms, Hamas are a bunch of terrorists with access to heavy weapons. Hezbollah is an army. While Hamas is estimated to have 30,000 fighters, Hezbollah boasts it can call on 100,000 militants. Even if that number is exaggerated, their overall force is still in the high tens of thousands, many of whom are battle-hardened by fighting in real wars. We don't just mean the 2006 war with Israel. Over the last decade and a half, Hezbollah's troops have fought in Iraq, helped keep Assad in power in Syria, and trained the Houthis in Yemen. They've also been extremely well equipped by Iran. When Hamas fired a barrage of around 2,500 rockets to begin their October the 7th assault, it was considered an overwhelming number. Hezbollah, by contrast, is thought to have 150,000 missiles backed by thousands of drones. Politico reports that these include precision weapons which can carry a 500-kilogram warhead up to 300 kilometers with near pinpoint accuracy. That's enough to hit the whole of Israel. Should a serious war break out, Hezbollah would certainly target as many key locations in the Jewish state as possible. And nor would they just focus on infrastructure. Alongside their regular missiles, Hezbollah also have a stockpile of anti-ship missiles, enough to potentially blockade Israel's coast. They even have sophisticated air defense systems. As the Politico article sums up, Hezbollah could easily be compared to a disciplined, well-trained, mid-sized European army. Of course, even this arsenal pales in comparison to what the IDF has, and Israel has made it perfectly clear that an attack by Hezbollah would result in the whole of Lebanon being targeted. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant vowed to take the country back to the Stone Age if Hezbollah opens a new front. Still, while Israel would likely win a war with Hezbollah, it would only do so at a high cost, which is why it's vital for both sides to be aware of where the other's red line lies. Heiko Women has outlined 2 triggers which might convince Hezbollah to enter the war.
Just before the 2, I gotta pee quick, guys. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. We're good. I washed my hands.
One is the forced displacement or expulsion of a large number of Gaza residents from the Strip, say into a refugee camp in Egypt. Another is the complete destruction of Hamas. Writing on X, Women explained that Hezbollah and Iran have invested heavily to make Hamas an effective member of their alliance. Defending Palestine is at the heart of their ideology. Losing Hamas and yet another piece of Palestine would be a terrible blow. They may be ready to take risks to prevent that. Those risks won't necessarily be launching an all-out war. Women outlined a scenario where Hezbollah gradually steps up its attacks, keeping the IDF distracted and causing destruction in Israel's north without ever crossing the line into full-blown conflict. Such a move would come with its own risks, including inviting an Israeli backlash once Hamas was subdued or accidentally triggering the war that it was trying to avoid. At this point, though, it's impossible to know if Hezbollah's red lines are real or just bluster. Not that they're the only force with the power to expand the conflict. There are also the governments of Iran and Syria. And, well, speaking of bleak assessments, they don't come much bleaker than that of King Abdullah II of Jordan. On October the 17th, he said of the growing conflict, quote, "The whole region is on the brink of falling into the abyss."
And I think of Jordan, I've maybe I'm wrong. I've thought of Jordan as like the, I don't know the right word. I was going to say more rational, but that's from my point of view. So just like they seem to be one of the more kind of, like if Jordan is like saying ready for war, then I'm like, oh God, the whole Middle East. Does that make sense? I should just...
As the head of state of a US ally with a large Palestinian population that borders both the West Bank and Israel's internationally recognized territory, the king should probably know better than anybody the geopolitical risks, especially when you consider the nation sitting on his northern border, Syria. Since October the 7th, Syria under Bashar al-Assad has seen bursts of violence linked to the growing Israel-Hamas conflict. Bursts of violence that remain small for now, but which have the potential to erupt into something far uglier. On October the 10th, for example, mortars were fired from Syria into the Israel-occupied Golan Heights. 2 days later, Israeli strikes simultaneously hit Damascus and Aleppo airports. After another 2 days had passed, Aleppo airport was struck again. From a military perspective, the strikes on Syria's 2 major airports were intended to stop Iran from transferring weapons there, but they were also likely warnings to the Syrian regime to not open up a new front in the war. On the face of it, such a warning seems unnecessary. Syria is still a hot mess after over a decade of civil war. Its air force is small and weak, and it does little in the way of missiles and drones. While Assad seems to hold chemical weapons, the Syrian army, bogged down with its own war at home, would pose a far smaller threat to Israel than Hezbollah. Yet it's not Syria itself that Israel is trying to discourage from attacking, but the groups that use Syria as a convenient base. Specifically, groups linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Around the time of the airport strikes, multiple sources reported worrying troop movements in Syria. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy tracked Iran-backed Syrian militants redeploying fighters to near the Golan Heights, while around 50 Iraqi militia fighters with shoulder-launched rockets were transferred to Damascus, close to Lebanon. Others were moved to the Israeli border along with equipment like drones and jamming systems. The Institute for the Study of War has even tracked the Quds Force commander Brigadier General Ismail Ghani in Syria, coordinating these activities. All told, the ISW has assessed that, quote, these deployments are consistent with the scenario in which the Gaza conflict expands into a multi-front war surrounding Israel. This is an assessment seemingly backed up by Iran's foreign minister, who recently declared, if the measures aimed at immediately stopping the Israeli attacks that are killing children in the Gaza Strip end in a deadlock, it is highly probable that many other fronts will be opened. Now, you'll notice that we deliberately didn't use a quote from Syria's government there. That's because Tehran is the major threat everyone is worried about, not Syria, beyond Bashar al-Assad's willingness to let Iran use his country as a base for attacks. It's also why the US is focusing on back-channel warnings to the Islamic Republic. According to reports, American officials are urgently utilizing go-betweens in Qatar and China to convey to Tehran what will happen if Israel is attacked by a militia under its control.
I wouldn't say that Iran is my biggest fear in the Middle East. In like Iran stepping up its game is my big fear in the Middle East and with this conflict between Hamas and Israel, because it's not. My biggest fear is any sort of slight incline of kind of normalizing Israel and other Arab country relations could just crumble. So it's not Iran that I'm most worried. It's all of the other Arab states going back decades to, again, wanting to fight Israel again. That's my big fear.
The question,
other than a larger worldwide conflict, obviously,
is whether that's going to be enough. Because far more so than Hezbollah, it may be the strategic calculus being made in Iran that decides whether this war will expand in scope. Worryingly, it's not at all clear what side Tehran is going to come down on. In an anonymous briefing a few days ago, officials assured reporters at the Times that Iran itself does not plan to attack Israel if it is not attacked. However, they then immediately deflated any sense of relief over that statement by adding that Tehran and the Axis were still debating whether Hezbollah or some other proxy should open a new front instead. Honestly, this kind of mixed messaging feels very on brand for Iran right now, not just as a way to sow confusion, but because the costs and benefits of igniting a wider war seem so finely balanced that Tehran itself likely doesn't know for sure what it wants to do. So let's start by looking at one of the things that should be firmly in the pros list: America's ongoing distractions. The US is currently dealing with both the biggest land war in Europe since 1945, as well as the ongoing threat posed by China to allies in Asia, including Taiwan, but also Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. As The Guardian explains, the Biden administration's preoccupation with Ukraine and tilt to Asia look like opportunities when viewed from Tehran. On top of that, America itself is riven with internal divisions, including a House of Representatives that feels at times more like a crash between two clown cars than a serious governing body. Yet for all of America's distractions, Iran can't count on the US being unable to handle a Middle East war. President Biden has already committed to helping both Israel and Ukraine, and there's even talk of a major funding bill that would get military aid to both nations plus Taiwan in the near future. Likewise, one of the major potential cons is also murky. An Iranian attack on Israel would, at bare minimum, result in the immediate destruction of Tehran's nuclear program by Israeli and American strikes. As one of Iran's key tools for influencing the West, this should be a major loss. But with Russia fast becoming dependent on Iran to supply weapons for its war in Ukraine, Tehran might gamble that sealing an alliance with nuclear power Moscow is worth more in the long run. Then there are more abstract issues to consider, issues that are undoubtedly being discussed in the Islamic Republic right now. One is the weakened state of Iran itself. Although they've slipped off the headlines, Tehran is still dealing with mass protests and the economic fallout from that disruption. Engaging in a major war right now could have severe, unpredictable consequences for internal stability.
Again, every time he suggests like the reasons like that for not wanting to join the war, like Tehran's instability, or Iran, well, I can say Tehran's instability, the instability political situation in Iran and with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but those can both be seen as reasons to roll the dice to join a conflict and hope that it people rally around you, or you can point at another person for their problems.
Another is what might happen in Gaza in the coming days. While an Israeli assault that produces staggering civilian casualties might swing much of public opinion in the Middle East behind any group that opens a new front in the war, a much more limited incursion or a surprise quick defeat of Hamas would rob Tehran and its proxies of a casus belli. While an Israeli assault that produces staggering civilian casualties might swing much of public opinion in the Middle East behind any group that opens a new front in the war, a much more limited incursion or a surprise quick defeat of Hamas would rob Tehran and its proxies of a casus belli. Nor is it impossible that back-channel diplomacy will change the calculation, unlikely as it seems right now. Delicate talks are said to be taking place between Qatar and Hezbollah, aimed at keeping the latter out of the war. Separately, the Times of Israel reports that the Gulf Kingdom is likewise trying to coax Hamas into safely releasing the women, children, and elderly hostages taken on October the 7th. Since Qatar hosts Hamas's main office, the government in Doha has a lot of clout. While an agreement that diffuses the situation somewhat is unlikely, stranger things have happened. And yet, there's another argument that this video also needs to cover, one that suggests maybe all of this talk of calculations and risks is actually way off. One that suggests that when it comes to expanding the war, Iran, Hezbollah, and the Axis of Resistance have already made their choice. So a few days ago, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Middle East scholar Kenneth M. Pollack published a notable essay in Foreign Affairs. Notable because amid the growing fright and predictions of war, this piece instead suggested we should look at the situation with cautious optimism. When he emphasized the horror of the Hamas attacks and the potential for tragedy in Gaza, Pollack suggested the chances of other armed groups joining the conflict were relatively low. His reasoning? If Hezbollah or Iran was going to attack Israel, they'd have already done so. While there's some confusion at the moment about how aware Tehran was of Hamas's plans, Pollack's basic position is that the Islamic Republic probably knew what was coming and opted to not get involved. And this is important because if Iran and Hezbollah both really thought that they could take on the IDF, then the best course of action would have been to launch simultaneous attacks on October the 7th.
True.
You can easily imagine how awful that would have been. Israel was caught unprepared for a relatively low-tech influx of militants from Gaza, one that still managed to kill over 1,400 Israelis and take nearly 200 hostages. Now try and picture how much worse October the 7th would have been if the Gaza assault had been combined with a rocket barrage from Lebanon and an assault by Iranian proxies in Syria. Horrific as the death toll was, it would have been multiple times worse. It would have also seen the IDF split across multiple fronts, severely weakening their response. If Tehran wasn't willing to strike at Israel's maximum moment of weakness, then it seems unlikely to do so now that reservists have been called up and the country is on high alert.
But if you do an overwhelming assault on the 7th, if they did a conjoined thing rather than just, let Hamas do this one, then like you would give America such an easy decision, which is that like, okay, now we are defending Israel against Iran, Syria, and Hamas, and you would very likely lose against Israel and the U.S. You'd probably lose against just Israel. I would assume, maybe not, I don't know, but definitely with the U.S. And so maybe it was like, if you kind of have one after another and read the room, as in like read the world and how they see it, then maybe you can inflict more damage without pulling America like directly in.
Or to quote Pollack directly, the mere fact that Iran and Hezbollah did not participate in the initial Hamas assault when Israel was most vulnerable and least able to defend itself is not just the strongest evidence that neither is looking to fight Israel. It's incontrovertible evidence.
But I sort of disagree because, and all out of what I just said, like America isn't in the conflict. And so you inflicted that attack on Israel from Hamas without pulling America in. So that might have been a better option, and maybe, gradual, getting on your side of Arab countries than an all-out assault that you might kill many times more people initially. You definitely would. But it would be such a shock that like many countries would come in and then it'd just be all-out fighting and likely would lose.
If this is the case, and to be clear, we're not saying it definitely is, then escalation would seem unlikely. Tehran and Hezbollah would appear to fear the IDF too much. Israel, for its part, is too focused on the Hamas threat and a likely invasion of Gaza to turn its response to Hezbollah rocket attacks into an invasion of southern Lebanon. Pollack even thinks the Axis might be willing to sit back even if Israel follows through on its promise to annihilate Hamas, knowing, as they do, that the group could flee Gaza and reconstitute abroad just as the PLO did after being expelled by Israel in 1967. In his words, a wider war is possible, but at this point still appears unlikely. It's a reassuring conclusion to hear. Frankly, it's also important to get these sorts of takes in a moment of crisis, the ones that dampen worries rather than adding fuel to a bonfire of anxiety. Yet, we would be lying if we said we were entirely convinced. While we were working on this script, news came out of the bombing of a Gaza hospital that killed hundreds of civilians. While it's currently unclear which side fired the missile responsible, there's been no doubt about the reaction. Protests have swept the Middle East. The sense of rage in countries surrounding Israel is palpable. And that's potentially dangerous. One major calculation for Hezbollah and Iran right now is, what will everyone else do if we attack?
In my opinion, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, they already won. Like, you already won a giant victory in that. Look at what happened when you have all of these Arab leaders come on, to all clearly together, go on TV and say, like, we are against. The mere fact that you have revived Arab tension as a whole against Israeli Arab tensions is you have done a masterstroke. Like, if the intention of Iran or Hamas or whoever was pulling the puppet strings was to cause countries to get on a path towards just despising Israel again, A+, like, that was perfect. You look at how many people, you push people to certain sides, and now facts don't really even matter. I wasn't sure who bombed the hospital. From the evidence and more I've heard people, it does seem that Israel wasn't responsible. But when I just heard about it, I wasn't listening to anyone. I'm like, I don't believe either of you. Let's wait and see. But at this point, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much evidence you have. People are entrenched. And so already a success by Iran, in my opinion, if this was their goal. Even if it wasn't, it was I'm sure, a very nice surprise.
So long as the world's sympathies lie with Israel, Tehran and its proxies rightly fear an overwhelming backlash. The longer the bombardment of Gaza goes on, the more Palestinian civilians that die, the greater support for military action against Israel becomes in the Middle East. If it grows large enough, then it's just possible Iran or Hezbollah might decide they have enough public backing to do the unthinkable. In conclusion, then, we can only answer our headline question with an uncertain shrug. Are we heading for a wider Middle East war? We simply don't know. It could be that this growing crisis is yet contained, or it could be that we are all now like those European civilians in early summer 1914, unable to act, unable to do anything but watch with a sense of fatality as the whole of humanity marches, eyes wide open, into an inferno. Hopefully, diplomacy prevails.
Few things. One, think about like America, like in China, like squaring up, like you want to fight, and like they're in like a shit hole, and then it's like, don't go for Taiwan, don't go for it, but then like a hole opens, that with the Russia-Ukraine war, where U.S. has to send aid and do stuff, and then America has to plug. I'm like trying to think of a cartoon in my head, a political cartoon, like America has to plug a hole with its finger, and it's like, okay, well that's one arm gone. I'll still fight you though, China. And then boom, another hole opens up and water starts kind of dripping in, and that's Israel against Hamas, which America has to support. Again, China doesn't have anything to do with. Another hole. It's like, okay, we want to fight. Another hole opens up, and then at the end, it's just like, okay, China just takes Taiwan because the U.S. is too involved in helping all these other countries that I'm sure, even if so, the U.S. would be able to defend Taiwan. How much it would do so, I don't know. But the more conflicts popping up around the world definitely makes it easier for China to think about a potential assault on Taiwan. Or so If I'm China, I'm pretty happy about all the stuff going on. I'm happy about the war in Ukraine if I'm China. I'm happy about the war with Israel and Hamas if I'm China. And if I'm China, I'm just grabbing the popcorn, sitting back, and just waiting and seeing how bad it gets for America or America's allies. So that's one big thing there. It takes up American attention and resources, makes China feel like they might be able to get away with more. Number two is what I said. The main point is that if anyone was wishing to sow discord in the Middle East, they succeeded, okay? And I think even more so, this is a big point where I disagree with the point that, or the quote that was said a minute or two ago, where he said they would have done an all-out attack with Hamas on the 7th of November. I disagree, because at that point, you're making it way more difficult for Arab countries to be like, oh, crap, like who weren't involved with, let's say, Lebanon, Hamas, and Iran all attacked, to be like, well, as much as I don't like Israel and I sympathize with other Arab countries, this was an obvious attack and America is going to be dragged right in. We don't want that right now. So I think that this was a great scenario for Iran. You made people not like Israel in the Middle East much anymore, or any progress that was going towards acceptance with Israel in the Middle East. You really damaged it. And so I think this could be better than an all-out assault that sure would have killed more Israelis, but you're not destroying Israel. There's no way America is going to let that happen. And so it's going to be America. You just made it much more difficult for Arab countries to side with Hamas, Lebanon, and Iran, and made it much more easy for U.S. and other countries like allied with the U.S. to get directly involved. And so I think if you have a bigger plan of wanting to mess up the U.S. and the Middle East, then this was a much better masterstroke than an all-out assault. And so for him to say the fact that it wasn't done that way,
and least able to,
it is incontrovertible evidence. It's not the strongest evidence that neither Israel. Again, I just completely disagree. I think this was way better outcome than Iran could have ever hoped for, even with a coordinated attack with Hamas on Israel on the 7th. So big deal there. And I guess my last point is that this does scare me more for possibilities of conflict in the very near future, more so than even Russia and Ukraine. And it's compounding with it. It's not either or, it's on top of it. And then who knows what else is going to happen. It seems like the economies around the world, a lot of them aren't doing well. It makes people do some more drastic things. And it seems we're just overdue for a major global conflict. When learning back on history, it always amazes me that we're not in, like, there hasn't been another big war since World War II. And yeah, there's been Vietnam War, there's been the Korean War, there's been wars in America, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia. There's been conflict. But in terms of a war like the size of the Napoleonic Wars, of the 7 Years' War, even the Crimean War, or the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, nothing to those scales, I think, has happened. And yeah, we have nuclear weapons, so that's going to scare major conflicts, from major parties from fighting with each other. But it's not looking great. But I do tend to be a little more nervous. Like, I was more nervous about the Russia invading Ukraine when it happened than I am now. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't be nervous still, and we shouldn't be nervous. But yeah, great video. I'd appreciate any answers to any questions I had, or if I said something wrong, any comments. I'd appreciate it all. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you guys next video. Bye, guys.